It's finally here, the Between Worlds Seasonal Edition of Tournament Tactician. My name is Boulevard, and welcome to my tournament tier list. As was announced a few hours ago, I will be casting the Between the Worlds Seasonal Swiss rounds with Jay Doze, my usual co-caster, so it's going to be a really fun cast. I'm going to be dressing up as Jace from Arcane. You'll see the side-by-side pictures so that you can see how bad I look, but I'm very excited to be doing this for you, rounding out my second year of casting, but you don't want to hear me talk about all that. I'll save some of that for the end. You just want me to get right into the tier list. I understand. Let's see what I can help you with. Off the cuff, you're going to notice a few different things. Number one, Tier 3 is back. Got a lot of people on Twitter asking me what about X deck that I had talked about in Tournament Tactician but wasn't present on the tier list when I posted it on Twitter, so I've brought that back as a permanent fixture. Best and worst matchup is just a seasonal thing. This is not meant to be a comprehensive picture of the matchup charts, although I will link the matchup charts that I use in the description below so that you can explore that on your own in case you don't know where to find them or things like that. But I just wanted to give you a nice little visual picture of, you're lining up your decks side by side, you're checking their best matchups, noticing overlaps and things like that. Maybe maybe your worst matchups are a little bit too varied and you notice some top decks in there that you weren't planning on banning, and these might be a few percentage points off of a different matchup. Like, for example, if BC Swain is Elusive Rally's worst matchup, let's say they have a 30% win rate, there might have been another matchup where they had like a 35% win rate, and it's very close to being their worst matchup. But I just kind of wanted to make things a little easy for you at a glance. Again, this is not meant to paint an entire picture, but if you notice that, for example, Darkness is your worst match or your best matchup, then you're like, hey, maybe I do well into other control decks and other decks that play like Darkness. That's kind of more of what I was looking to give you. This, don't worry about this. We'll get into that a little bit later. So, starting things off, I wanted to talk about Elusive Rally, Lee Sin, and Plunder. These are, from my perception, these should be the three most popular decks at the Seasonal. It's not uncommon for a lineup to just consist of the best three decks, and if that does happen, I would imagine it'll look something like this. Sivir Demacia, I'm pretty confident, is going to be the fourth most popular deck. I do not think it is going to break into the top three, even if I am wrong about what this top three is. That's kind of based on like compounding evidence over the course of the season, as well as some personal bias, as well as, just Lee Sin always has this big spike right before the seasonal and during the seasonal, and things like that. And then Sivir Demacia just has like been falling off a little bit, but maintaining a steady presence. And Scion has been falling off and not really maintaining a steady presence. So Scion, I'm a little less optimistic for. It might be the fifth deck rounding things out, or it might just completely flop this weekend, and I'm actually starting to think that it might just completely flop this weekend. But it's still a very strong ladder deck, and again, the ladder meta does influence the seasonal pretty heavily, so we'll figure that out as we get into it. And then Darkness, I wanted to double down on and keep in tier 1. So Elusive Rally, because I do want to go by this deck by deck. Your best matchup is Lee Sin, your worst matchup is Bandle City Swain. And then over here on the side, these things I told you we'd get into a little bit later. So these are the sort of worst matchups for the top three decks. So that at a glance you could say, hey, if I trust Boulevard, and I also think that Elusive Rally, Lee Sin, and Plunder are going to be the three most popular decks, what should my lineup look like? And you'll notice that the main overlaps here is that Elusive Rally is doing very well against both Plunder and Lee Sin, and then Bandle City Swain and Shellfolk is beating both Elusive Rally and Lee Sin. So these are decks that you might want to consider. If you're on the ban Plunder strategy, then maybe Bandle City Swain and Shellfolk is somewhere that you want to start your lineup. And when I say Shellfolk, I mean Lux Poppy Shellfolk. So it would be a little hard to fit Elusive Rally as well as the Lux Poppy Shellfolk into your lineup, so keep that in mind. But I did want to give you just a nice little visual of like, hey, these are the overlapping bad matchups that these decks have. It's really not an insane amount of overlap, but again, this might help influence your ban strategy if, for example, you are playing Elusive Rally, Plunder, and Lee Sin, and you run into another Elusive Rally, Lee Sin, Plunder matchup. What deck do I want to ban? Have I teched for any of these specific matchups? Maybe I took a one-deck adaptation, like I dropped the Lee Sin for something else, but I'm still playing Plunder and Elusive Rally, things like that. I think Elusive Rally is probably... if I had to crown something the best deck in the game, it might be Elusive Rally, solely because Plunder is perceivably the best deck in the game, or was at least a week or two ago, and the meta really started to shift around that, and Elusive Rally maintained its strength throughout the entire format and does very well into the meta that is looking to counter Plunder. Elusive Rally will likely be one of the more banned decks on the weekend, though that's not something we can really track, and I did just want to shout it out as the deck that has been dominating ladder, dominating tournaments. It can lose to itself. It's got some brick hands. Rally decks always have, they always will, but it plays it's so far outside of the realm of what the other top decks are doing, so much more aggressively, but so much more combat trick heavy to the point where it's not as susceptible to removal as something like Sivir Auction. Because Sivir Auction isn't killing you on turn 4 or 5 or 6 like Poppy is, just because they'll get out a bunch of elusives, they'll play the Poppy, turn 5, I attack with Poppy, I rally, I attack with Poppy, and all my elusives again. That's the end of the ballgame. Sivir Demacia isn't doing something like that to you. So that's kind of where Elusive Rally is coming up, is it's like the least mid-range deck among the top contenders, and therefore is not losing to the same thing that these other top decks are. That's why Elusive Rally is doing so well. Bandle City Swain seems like it actually has some good matchups into a lot of the top decks. It's something that I've really got my eye on going into the weekend, but you should already know if that was a deck that you were big on. The triple Scorched Earth style of gameplay is something that I'm really big on, as the landmark decks look really good into the meta. Both Thralls, Bandle Tree, Star Spring, and BC Swain is really the only deck that's running Scorched Earth and landmark removal in general in the main. So this is definitely like my dark horse pick for the event this weekend. And I say dark horse very loosely because like it is a known factor, right? It's not like completely out of the blue, but I don't think a lot of people are expecting this to put up big numbers. Neither am I, but I am expecting it to do very well. Lee Sin. I don't really know what I can say about Lee Sin that I haven't said in the past. This deck shows up every seasonal. It is the only deck that has topped every single seasonal thus far in Legends of Runeterra. And then Star Spring, of course, has its 100% top 32 appearance, but doesn't always make it through the Swiss rounds. Best matchup is Scion. Worst matchup is Bandle Tree. Lee Sin is something that is a little susceptible to some of the counter play. And when I say that, I mean, for weeks I talked about Plunder being countered by Control. And last week, we finally started to see those control decks pop up to counter Plunder. If people take it a step further and they are looking to beat these control decks, that is going to be things like Star Spring and Bandle Tree and Shell Folk. And these are not decks that Lee Sin does very well into, but Lee Sin does do well into control matchups in general. So I do think that Lee Sin will still be a very strong contender. I think you are not going to see too many people going to the second level. They're going to stay at level 0, which is the top 3 decks, and level 1, which is countering the top 3 decks. Not too many people are going to go level 2, at least not so many that it is a risk to run Lee Sin. Lee Sin is still and always has been one of the best decks in Legends of Runeterra history, and I fully support anybody that wants to run this deck, regardless of the lineup that you're going for. It's just so good if you're good at Lee Sin. Then, of course, Plunder, the big sort of target on its back for the format. While Elusive Rally looks to be one of the best and most popular decks, because there are so many different Poppy decks that are going to pop up, it's very difficult to come in and say, hey, I'm going to counter Poppy. Plunder is something that is a little bit easier to counter. There's not too many Gangplank decks. It's really just Plunder and Bandle Pirates. They have similar enough matchup charts that if you are looking to beat Plunder, you will probably do good enough into Bandle Pirates. Maybe you don't do as well into a triple aggro lineup if that's where the Bandle Pirates finds itself. If they're like Bandle Pirates, Ziggs Poppy, and then, I don't know, like a very burn-centric Scion build, yeah, maybe then you don't do as well. But Plunder definitely seeks to be the most popular deck, especially given the last week, because last week we started to counter Plunder, and Plunder still did extremely well. So it's not quite TF Fizz level where you cannot counter this, but it is more resilient than I think people are giving it credit for because the deck seems so straightforward on paper. Best matchup, Bandle City Swain. Worst matchup, Thralls. Thralls, Field of Rush, Lee Sin. It's the lineup that MTUC won the online league series with. It's a lineup that I'm a big fan of, and it's sort of brought Thralls back into the meta as well as Field of Rush. And that's where I think Darkness is going to come up a little bit as well, as just like something that continues on to this control-dominated meta and looks to beat the Plunder and maybe even the Lee Sin or things like that. Effectively, you know, if you can run Minimorph to deal with Lee Sin and still beat Plunder, that's kind of where I want my Darkness deck to be, and I think it's very doable to get it into that position. But Plunder is definitely going to be the deck of the weekend with the biggest target on its back, but that's okay, because when we scroll over here and we look at sort of its bad matchups, there's really not a lot of them. It's really just the other 2 tier 1 decks, and then Thralls is like a big spike to it. I was really only going for things that were worse than 45-55 because, you know, I want things that are like actually beating this deck, not things that can get swung by player skill and the percentage points or comfort on the deck, things of that nature. So when we talk about like actual bad matchups for Plunder, there's really not a lot of them, just the Rally, Thralls, and Lee Sin. But yeah, Plunder just really doesn't have a lot of bad matchups. Even Field of Rush, which is considered to be one of its bigger counters, is only a 45-55 on ladder. It's probably going to swing a lot harder in Field of Rush's favor in tournament because you're not getting a lot of people that are inexperienced on Field of Rush. You're getting people that really know what they're doing, potentially have been playing this deck for upwards of a year or at least similar decks. And I think that Plunder is going to probably be more popular than it should be, but like the deck is so solid, and it's always been so solid, but it's never really felt anything more than solid. Like a lot of its matchups are in the blue, or the green, as you would want to say. You know, they're looking very strong, but overall, it's really a lot of like 55-45s. Sivir Demacia has been falling off a little bit, sort of waning. It does very well into Darkness, which, like, who other than me is telling you to run Darkness? And it does very poorly into Scion. Scion has started to fall off a little bit, and Sivir Demacia just tends to not do super well into other mid-rangey decks. Like, it doesn't do very well versus Plunder. It's not really killing Lee Sin as effectively as Sivir decks did in the past. It's doing okay into Elusive Rally. It's not like a wash either way. But Sivir Demacia is probably going to maintain some semblance of presence in the meta because it does do a very good job of rounding out a lineup if you are looking to do well into the control decks that are looking to beat out Plunder. Sivir Demacia sort of slots pretty naturally into just best deck lineup of Elusive Rally, Lee Sin, Plunder. You just take out one of those decks for Sivir Demacia. You're not really throwing off your matchup charts in a super incohesive way. It jives pretty well, replacing really any deck in that lineup, and you're going to feel okay about it. Just because of the flexibility of the matchups of all these different decks. There's a lot of things, like Sivir Demacia is a very deceptively hard deck to play, and you will be rewarded if you can play it well, sort of like Lee Sin and Darkness, which is why I like them a little bit more than I like Elusive Rally and Plunder. They're a little bit on the simpler side, not that they're easy by any stretch of the imagination, but Sivir Demacia and Lee Sin are certainly the two harder decks among the big four. So if you are comfortable with Sivir Demacia, absolutely run it, especially as Scion, which is one of your worst matchups, continues to sort of fall out of favor. But if you are going to run Sivir Demacia, do keep in mind that you have a pretty bad Plunder matchup, so either be on the ban that strategy or just look to beat their other deck. Definitely don't bring Sivir Demacia into like an anti-Plunder lineup if that's something that you're looking to leave open in 2-0, because Sivir Demacia does have some pretty swingy matchups. You don't want to come in and say, I'll just leave Plunder open, run into 7 people playing Plunder, and then their other deck just has a good Sivir matchup. So be wary on that one. But I do still think it's going to be pretty popular and pretty successful for the players that do end up bringing it. And then Darkness. How can I keep defending this one? Good Lee Sin matchup, baby. That's all I need. Yeah, you suck versus Elusive Rally. You suck versus most poppy decks, but we're not in the same spot that we were during the Beyond the Bandlewood Seasonal, where there was like 5 poppy decks in every lineup. Yeah, I know. The math worked out crazy. It was just, usually they'd bring like 1 poppy deck, 1 Lulu deck, and then like 1 Yordles and Arms deck, and they were effectively just, triple Demacia rally on you, which is what Darkness is struggling with. But I think Darkness does very well versus the other control decks in the meta. So if anybody that is going at level 1, where they want to be countering the Plunder, Darkness is going to do very well into them, while still having a pretty good shot at beating both Lee Sin and Plunder out of sort of the main lineup. If they have adapted and they've like taken out the Lee Sin for Sivir Demacia and they're just like Elusive Rally, Sivir Demacia, Plunder, that's where Darkness is going to falter, and it's why I would not really recommend running it in the open rounds as much. We always see Darkness do okay. I say always, we've only had one seasonal with Darkness out. So effectively in the last seasonal Beyond the Bandlewood, Darkness did okay in the open rounds. I think about 6 out of the top 32 players were running Darkness, and then I had thought that anybody who was confident enough on Darkness to win these matchups was going to run in the Swiss rounds. I was wrong. It went up to like 9 or 10 players once we got to the top 32. I expect Darkness to follow a similar vein. It's not quite on the level of Lee Sin, where players will just jam this at all times. It's a little bit more nuanced than that, and a little bit better suited for a known factor meta like the top cut, but I still think that it's going to do very better than people would expect in the Swiss portion. And again, it's really coming out as that level 0 is just running the best 3 decks, level 1 is countering that. I think it does very well into the level 1 lineups. God, I hope this has been cohesive so far. Starting off in Tier 2, I want to talk about Bandle City Swain. This is a deck that started off the format very strong and then kind of fell to the wayside. Oh, look at that, Plunder is its worst matchup. I wonder what could have happened in a meta shift to make Bandle City Swain fall off a little bit. But as I mentioned earlier, it does very well into both Elusive Rally and Lee Sin. So if you're looking to sort of counter the level 0 lineup, but still ban Plunder, or just like have a very solid starting point, I think Bandle City Swain is exactly where you want to be, because it also does very well into the level 2 lineup. And it doesn't do terribly into level 1. The problem with level 1 being like triple control decks is that Swain just has never really handled control very well. It's like a quintessential, I do very mid-range borderline control things. And I Ravenous Flock is going to carry me through sort of the other mid-range matchups. But Control, you are so light on threats that it can be very difficult for you. So that's kind of where Bandle City Swain is sitting. Does very well into level 0 and level 2, not so much into level 1. I'm sorry if that's confusing that I keep using this terminology, but I'm going to need you to keep up because I don't know how else to say it in a concise way. Bandletree is a deck that I've been very big on recently. Just playing it on ladder a lot. I haven't really like sung its gospel on Twitter or in these tournament tactician videos, but it's a deck that I find very fun, so I've been playing it on ladder when I do play, and it does very well into Lee Sin, obviously. It does very poorly into Scion, but again, Scion is a deck that has started to fall off. Lee Sin is a deck that we expect to be popular, and it does very well into the level 1s. Control decks do not handle landmark win condition decks particularly well, and that's where Bandletree is coming in big. Not going to do super well into Sivir Akshan, mostly because the Absolver is something that's going to just push through your board pretty easily, on top of the fact that there's no great like mini morph target in Sivir Demacia. But if you are looking for something to round out sort of a counter Lee Sin lineup, this is not a bad starting point, as well as the elusive rally from my experience is... It's sketchy, but it's definitely winnable for you. You have the removal to sort of chew through their combat tricks. Ravenous Flock just being an extremely good card. Maybe you need to tech a little bit harder for that matchup, but I do think it's not something that's going to just completely wash you. Of course, that's coming from the Bandletree player side. It is what it is. I'm a little biased towards the deck because that's the side of the matchup that I've been playing, but I think that Bandletree is going to do fairly well this weekend. Players have really started to pick up on it again as we've moved towards the seasonal, and ultimately I'm just optimistic for it. Shellfolk, Lux Poppy, or even just the Fizz Vi version, both similar enough matchup charts, but honestly, the reason that I moved the reason I took the Fizz Vi sample out of here is because I needed room for the best and worst matchups and to get my camera on here. Sorry, Fizz Vi. But if you're playing Shellfolk, you probably know what that looks like. It's probably, I would say, the second best Poppy deck in the game, with number 1 being Elusive Rally and number 3 probably being Bandletree, followed by Ziggs Poppy, if I had to rank them, but I don't think anyone's really asking me to do that. You do very well into Lee Sin, very poorly into Bandletree, but again, this is one of those matchups where there's not an insane amount of ladder data, so you got to take these with a grain of salt. But ultimately, I think Shellfolk is just a deck that is difficult to play against. So if you are comfortable on this, and you can find a lineup around it, I think you're going to have a phenomenal time. There's really not too much more to say about that without like really diving into it and getting complex, so I'm not going to get too deep into Shellfolk's Scion. I've been dogging Scion a bit lately. I've been going to the newspaper and I have been writing mean things about Scion. And let's talk about why. So it's got a good Sivir matchup. It's got a good Elusive Rally matchup. It doesn't do very well into Lee Sin. Its Plunder matchup is kind of whatever. It's not favored, but again, with comfort on the deck, you can kind of flip that. So why has Scion not been appearing in tournaments as much? Because it was nearly absent from the previous weekend of tournaments, with only 1 taking a top spot out of 4 events that I got to look at between the Online League Series, Bandle Gunner Cup number 2, and the EU and AM Fight Night. My general theory, because the deck is still doing very well on ladder, the data is not pointing towards any explicit reason why Scion would be falling off. The things that I would point to is 1, Sivir Demacia is falling off a little bit because it has a bad Plunder matchup, meaning that one of your best matchups is falling to the wayside a little bit. Number 2, Scion might be like the 6th best deck in the game, and it's very hard to find a strong reason to put it in your lineup over any of the 5 above it. It doesn't have some big spike counter that it gets to put in and say, like, yes, this is the missing piece of the puzzle for, like, my counter Elusive Rally lineup. It can certainly be that. Scion has always done very well into Poppy decks in general across the board, just really any flavor of Poppy. So I think that Scion still will have a high presence, since I do think Poppy will be very popular. But if it doesn't, I'm not going to be super surprised. I think it really is just a matter of like these other decks being slightly stronger and players not finding the mystical, magical reason to put Scion in over any of their other decks. It's not like this big conspiracy theory. It's just like it's slightly worse by a few percentage points, and players just aren't willing to make a call like that, on top of how bad it can feel to just not draw Scion on 7. The deck is a well-oiled machine, but even things like that can break down. And I think players have just experienced the breakdown a little bit too much because Scion has been dominant for so long. I would imagine pretty much every top player has put in dozens of hours on Scion at this point and knows whether or not they don't like it. It's very possible that Scion is something that I am overlooking and it'll break into the top 3. That's kind of the read that I've had on Scion, is it is either going to outperform my expectations, and I'm dumb for thinking that the top 3 is going to be Elusive Rally, Lee Sin, and Plunder, when obviously Scion is going to fit in there somewhere, or Scion is just gonna not show up at all. I'm talking like 5 or less Scion in the top 32. I do not think it is going to be a middle of the road weekend for Scion. I think that it is either going to highly outperform my expectations or severely underperform the community expectations. I do not think it is taking the middle of the road on this one. Why did I get that read? Mind your business. Those are secrets of the trade. So, moving on to Thralls. Back in tier 2, I've been big on this deck for a while. It was sort of the first one that I took off the tier list after keeping it in tier 2 for so long, solely because I was tired of talking about it every week and defending it when players weren't showing up with it. And of course, right after I take it off, it gets a big spike because it does very well into both Plunder and Scion, which again, if you think that Scion is going to do very well, then boom, Thralls is taking out two of the most popular decks in the game right there, right? Because I don't think anyone's going to argue that Plunder is not going to be in the top 3. It certainly will. And then it doesn't do very well versus Elusive Rally. So Thralls is just like a phenomenal choice if you are on the ban Poppy strategy, because even the level 1 lineups, the control lineups, have a lot of difficulty either killing Thralls before they pop off or dealing with the Thralls when they do pop off, because Bandle City Swain is really the only deck in the game that is running landmark removal, so you don't really have to worry about that as much. You're not going to see anybody running Aftershocks or Crumbles or things like that. Thralls just has really good matchup charts into the decks that you expect to see. Where Thralls is going to struggle is in some of the more like rogue matchups, the things that you weren't expecting to see, the stuff where you go, oh man, I really had to play this guy round 1. That's where Thralls is going to struggle a little bit. But I think this deck is very, very good for players who are looking to level 1 it. Or even level 2 it. You know, that's kind of where Thralls come in. It doesn't level 0 super well. It level 0 is good enough. It levels 1 pretty well, and it level 2 is pretty good, right? So again, just because I keep throwing out the terminology, level 0, top 3 decks. Level 1, beating the top 3 decks. Level 2, beating level 1. Is that cohesive? God, I hope it is, because I've said that like 10 times this video. So hopefully you keep understanding what I'm saying when I say that. Then Feel the Rush. Plunder, best matchup. Lee Sin, worst matchup. Feel the Rush has been a little bit more volatile than Thralls. Players are not picking up on this one as hard as the Plunder matchup, or as the Plunder counter, rather. But again, Thralls, Feel the Rush, Lee Sin, that was MTUC lineup from the Online League series. I thought it was very good. I expect to see a fair amount of that is like sort of your standard level 1 lineup. Maybe you replace the FTR with Darkness or the Lee Sin with a control deck that you're a little bit more comfortable on, because obviously MTUC is a very familiar Lee Sin player. I don't expect everybody who is level 1ing it to necessarily be able to play Lee Sin at a high level, and I still think you can level 1 it without Lee Sin and still have a pretty fair amount of success. So that's kind of where Feel the Rush is just kind of coming in. Players not in love with consistency issues of it that sort of Freljord Shadow Isle has always had. But the one thing that Feel the Rush really has going for it, and Spooky Viego to a lesser extent, there's not a lot of atrocity answers in the format. Bandle City Swain, again, the only one that is running execute style abilities, which again is really only something that you can do with a little bit of setup. And Minimorph is not really being played in en masse is probably the best way to put it, right? And even if Minimorph is being run en masse, it's hard to just have 2 Minimorph ready to go when a Feel the Rush hits the board. So the atrocities are just doing better than they really ever have. Lee Sin is the only Ionia deck in the format that is running things like Deny and Will of Ionia. Yes, Elusive Rally exists, but they're only on Nopify. They're not running Deny. They're not running Will of Ionia. There's no Homecomings that you need to worry about unless Mo is serious about bringing a Zero Relia. So I think Atrocity is just in like a really good spot in the meta, and that is one of the reasons that Feel the Rush is doing so well. On top of the fact that like Commander Ladros is just a good card, right? Speaking of Ladros, Sentinel Control. If you haven't seen this one before, Elise, Jace, Vi, it doesn't necessarily have to be those champions in that specific order. From what I understand, Elise is mandatory, and then you can really run any champions past that. If I remember correctly, the Tank Buster topped the Online League series with Elise, Vi, and Kindred. Just didn't run Jace at all, and played a much different version of the deck than the sample that I've provided for you here. Poppy Ziggs as your best matchup definitely seems a little bit weird. Thralls as your worst matchup is one of the reasons that you're kind of questionable. Like, this is a very solid level 1 deck. This is a great control deck that is going to do very nice things into the level 0 of the format, as well as handle the rogue decks a little bit better, because it does have its own solitaire game plan in a way that most control decks don't, where you can proactively play with the Buru Sentinels and the Burgeoning Sentinels and try to aggro your opponent down if they want to sit there and do nothing. And then if you just take it to the late game, hey, here's Commander Ladros, here's Atrocity. Again, Atrocity in a great spot. Not a lot of answers to that card being run. And I think it's just a really solid deck across the board. One of the more solid Piltover and Zon Shadow Isle decks than we've seen in a long time. It's not a Jace deck in the way that you probably want it to be. It's not like the Production Surge Jace decks, which, as you will notice, are absent from the tier list because they haven't really performed in any tournaments. They did a little bit at the Bandle Gunner Cup, but their ladder stats leave a little bit to be desired. And as fun as Jace is, I don't think it's going to do much this weekend outside of Sentinel Control. I thought that Jace would be figured out by now, but it looks like the community needs just a little bit more time. We'll get a nice influx of cards after the next set drops. I think it's called Magical Misadventures, which should be dropping after the seasonal, because if it's not, I don't know what I'm going to do. But yeah, Sentinel Control, very solid level 1 deck. Probably doesn't do as well into the other level 1s as you want it to. Like, if we're talking level 1 lineups, I think Darkness does very well into the level 1s, and Sentinel Control probably does some of the worst into the level 1s, unless you can aggro your opponent out with the Sentinel game plan. But again, you're trying that into a control deck. They might not even play a unit for you to slay, and that's kind of where the inconsistencies are going to catch up with you. But I do think the deck is solid. Spooky Viego, sort of the only other deny deck in the format, and also runs Atrocity. I like this deck a fair amount. It does very well into Thralls, does very poorly into Bandletree. This is sort of like a middle of the pack level 1 deck where you are never beating Darkness, but you are beating Thralls, and then I think Field of Rush. I would imagine Spooky Viego beats Field of Rush because you have the denies for the FTR. You have your own Viego that's coming down to contest Trundle on the same turn, as well as like Greenglade Lookout is something that can really get away from FTR very quickly because it comes down on turn 2. That's too early in the game for them to avalanche it. You have the Spirit's Refuge and Twin Disciplines to actually protect that, and I think that you can just get down like a super early invasive Hydrovine against something like FTR. So I would put this at like very high on the level 1 tier list. Like, it loses to Darkness, but obviously it's going to lose to Darkness. And then you're also going to lose to like the level 2 lineups, hardcore, like Bandletree and things like that, Starspring perhaps. But overall, like I think Spooky Viego is like a very good choice if you know how to run it. Cough, cough, Cameron Hanzo, please run Spooky Viego and Thralls. But if you're not Cameron Hanzo, this is something that you need to take a little bit of a closer look at. It's a weird deck. I've said it before. It doesn't really play like many of the other decks in the format, and that's kind of just where it is. But again, I'm just like kind of doubling down on like very solid level 1 deck that will do well into other level 1 decks. Doesn't do as well into the level 0 as you would want it to, but if you're solid on the deck, I think that the matchup charts on ladder are something that you can nearly completely ignore and just take your personal bias on this one. Bandle Pirates, the other Gangplank deck that everybody seems to have forgotten about. When Gangplank was fighting for Supremacy, this is the one that came out on the worst end of the head-to-head. If we're talking Bandle Pirates versus Plunder, Plunder wins. That's why Bandle Pirates isn't doing very well, but it is the better Gangplank deck if you are just running triple aggro. Because this is probably one of the worst seasonals for triple aggro, or rather, this is one of the worst seasonals for triple burn. Because I think that like Bandle Pirates, Elusive Rally, and then like another aggro deck is probably going to be fine. I wouldn't expect too much of it. Aggro has always historically done pretty poor at seasonals, outside of like obviously Mo winning. But it's usually something that we don't like. Triple aggro lineups have a extremely poor conversion rate into a top 32 across all seasonals, and I think this is just going to be another drop in the statistical bucket for me to bring up when I talk about how poor triple aggro lineups have performed across all seasonals. So that's kind of where I am on Bandle Pirates. Really don't run it unless you're running triple aggro. Not big on triple aggro. Plunder is just going to be better most of the time, unless you maybe want to level 0 it and say, hey, if you're looking to specifically counter Plunder, but I have brought Bandle Pirates, a burn-oriented Scion, and Elusive Rally, then you kind of beat a lot of the things that are coming in to beat Plunder while still having a relatively similar power level. So Bandle Pirates, while I'm not huge on it, I do see its place in the meta. It has a very specific high-value lineup in what I just mentioned. So take that as it is. Starspring. This is a deck that, again, 100% or not a 100% play rate in Swiss rounds into top 32, but a 100% play rate once we actually get to the top 32. Do not expect that to change this seasonal. Does very well into both Plunder and Lee Sin, and then does very poorly into Elusive Rally. And anything that has 2 good matchups into the level 0 lineup is something that players are going to get behind. Bandle City Swain is another area where you are going to struggle a lot. It really does everything that is nightmare fuel for Starspring. It has a big, fearsome threat in Swain. It has landmark removal out the ass in triple Scorched Earth. and it has a win condition that doesn't necessarily mean going into combat with you in like Leviathan and the Shrooms and things like that. So I think that like Bandle City Swain is nightmare fuel for Starspring, but it's just a deck that has solid matchups into Lee Sin and Plunder. It is a hard counter deck. It always has been. It'll probably put a couple people into top 32 this time around. I've heard whispers of it start to pop back up, and ultimately I think it's like a really good level 2 deck, but I wouldn't recommend going level 2. So yeah, Tom Rocka going to show up in Top Cut for sure. Might not make it into the Top Cut, but someone will swap onto it. And then finally, to round things out, Ziggs Poppy. Sort of the Alpha Poppy, as Coach Hua always like to call it, the deck that beats other Poppy decks. This is a deck that will do pretty well in your anti-Poppy lineup. If you just want to bring like Ziggs Poppy, Scion, if like the Elusive Rally is the deck that you want to be picking on, then like Scion, Bandle City Swain, and Ziggs Poppy, maybe that's where you're looking. But you can't do Bandle City and Noxus for both Ziggs Poppy and Bandle City Swain, and I think that Bandle City Swain does win out a little bit on that one, which is part of the reason that Ziggs Poppy has fallen down to tier 3. I think that Bandle City Swain is just the better Bandle City Noxus deck, and then Bandle Tree has such a different core game plan than Bandle City Swain that they get to exist in the same tier despite having a regional overlap, because they are just fitting into wildly different lineups. But anything that Ziggs Poppy wants to be doing, I think either Bandle Tree or Bandle City Swain does it a little bit better, unless you are just looking to smork the shit out of your opponent, because that is what Ziggs Poppy is still good at. But you really know if you want to be running triple aggro or not. You do very well into Thralls and Bandle City Swain. So like you've got the level 1 covered, the level 0 covered to an extent. But yeah, I mean it's fine. I expect to see it in Top Cut, but I don't expect it to be one of the top 5 or maybe even the top 10 decks. I think you'll get like 2 or 3. So that is going to more or less do it for this edition of the Seasonal. I hope you got some nugget of wisdom out there. I know this is a super long one, a little more in-depth than usual, and I do apologize for the all over the place nature of both the language and jumping around on the tier list and things like that. So, you know, I like the level 0, level 1, level 2 language. It's not something I'm going to use in my every week vocabulary, but definitely expect to open the broadcast with me explaining that concept and talking about it throughout the day. Because again, I am casting the Swiss portion of this upcoming seasonal on Saturday. Very much looking forward to it. And yeah, I'm going to have a good time with my usual casting partner, Jay Doza, and round out my second year of casting. Very excited for all of the progress that I've made this year. This is my 5th seasonal, and I just started getting seasonals in February, so the fact that I've already made it this far, I think is great. Mind you, this isn't like the 5th seasonal that I've touched. I'm counting Swiss portions and top 32s as separate events in that case. So this is, I think I've done 2 top cuts and 3 Swiss at this point. So a full house. Would love to get more top cuts next year. It's not really up to me. We'll see where that goes. But I do hope that you found some of this information helpful. Thank you so much for watching until the end. It really does mean the world to me that you guys show up for the seasonal edition of the Tournament Tactician. I really like doing these for you. It's fun to get this in depth. I wish I could do it more often for every Tournament Tactician, but when the stakes aren't high, there's not a lot of reason for me to pour 2 hours into a 15-minute video or 3 hours or 4 hours or however long the research takes me. But for these ones, it's definitely worth it. And I hope that I have left you with enough time to take this advice and practically applicate it. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. My name is Boulevard, and as always, good luck in your seasonal.